Welcome back. My name's Nick Norby, and I'm the host of History Up in Smoke, cigar chat of classical icons. And tonight I'm enjoying the Davidoff Winston Churchill 2022 limited edition in the Perfecto. And I have to say I've come to about the 1/3 mark of this cigar, and I am thoroughly enjoying it. It has a very rich, creamy, smoky flavor to it, which, ladies and gentlemen out there who enjoy cigars, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I mention that. And it also has a very nice clean burn, which is indicative of very good construction. And the flavors of this cigar are really opening up quite nicely. And I say that because when you talk about the perfecto shape of the cigar, it starts out very narrow, but as you consume more of the cigar, the ring gauge gets very large. And it just really begins to open up the flavors of the cigar. So I'm thoroughly enjoying this. And like I said, we've also been talking about Alexander the Great, one of the greatest military commanders in all of human history. And as I look at this cigar, I gotta ask, a question. If you asked me this question, would I be smoking a cigar 10 years or even 5 years ago? If you asked me that, I would say, heck no, I'm not a big cigar fan. But one thing that I always enjoyed, especially as a young man, was the aroma of a cigar and good pipe tobacco. There's just something that I always really enjoyed about it. I thought it was very relaxing, and that's one thing that I find about cigars since I've started smoking them about 2.5 years ago, is they're very relaxing, and I really, really enjoy it. But I remember my first cigar, that thing was horrible. It was stale, the wrapper on it was cracked, my mouth was very dry, and I could probably say that about my second and third cigars as well. But nonetheless, as I began to smoke more, I started to learn, and there's a huge learning curve with this because there's an encyclopedia of knowledge about cigars. And that's what I plan on doing on these various installments that I'm going to be doing in the future. I want to talk about things like storing your cigars, aging your cigars, cutting your cigars, lighting your cigars. I mean, they're the different sizes and designs of cigars. The list is really endless. But one thing that I like even more about cigars, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with the cigar itself, is the relaxation benefit I get. When you light up a cigar, something like this, you're probably going to smoke it for the next 45 minutes. If you get a larger cigar, you're probably about 2.5 hours. But what it does is it really slows you down. We live such crazy lives these days, whether it be work, school, life, everything. So many curveballs are thrown at us. And quite frankly, most people, their cortisol levels are so high, it doesn't matter if they're doing exercise or eating right. The level of stress in their lives is enough to make them a mess. And that's where I would say a nice health component of a good cigar comes in. It slows you down and relaxes you. But I also like the fact that cigars really bring people together. For example, if you go out with some friends, or you go to a local cigar bar, or you just meet people that are smoking cigars, it doesn't matter where you stack up on the economic sphere or the social political sphere, what your political views are, what your religious views are. It really brings people together. And I've often said this, and I don't know if I coined this, but when people get together and they're smoking cigars, they can solve the world's problems. And I think there's a little nugget of truth to that as well. But one thing that I like most about cigars, again, personally, when I have a cigar, not only am I relaxed, but I start to think, I start to reflect on life, things that are going on perhaps in the future or memories. And in this case, I like to think about and talk about history. And like I said, we've been talking about Alexander the Great, but he's not great yet. In the previous installment, Alexander's late father had passed away, and he inherited the Greek army along with the Macedonian army. And Alexander had been given the green light by the gods to move forward and attack the Persians. So Alexander begins his march to the westernmost part of the Persian Empire, which is Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, and he and his army pivot south on a small wedge of land known as the Hellespont. Now it's situated or bordered by the Aegean Sea on one side and the Sea of Marmara on the other. Now Alexander, as he gets to the edge of the water, he boards a small ship and he sails across to the mainland of Anatolia. And when the ship runs aground on the beach, Alexander leaps off the boat and he's scanning the landscape of the whole area. And as he's doing that, he looks up and he says, "From the gods, I accept Asia, won by the spear." He takes his spear and thrusts it into the sand, making a huge statement here. Maybe a little arrogant for a guy who's never actually won a battle. He's barely 20 years old, and he thinks he's going to take over the largest empire in the world, or at least Asia, that part of it. So Alexander does have a formidable force. He's inherited over 32,000 infantry, about 5,100 cavalry, several thousand that make up the phalanx, and one of his father's closest generals, the 65-year-old Parmenion, has about 10,000 additional troops. Now, man, it must have been an impressive sight, and I can only imagine what it looked like as Alexander sat on top Bucephalus, his favorite horse, with thousands of men marching next to him. And as they're walking and marching along, they're consuming everything in sight. I mean, you got to remember, 50,000 people, along with all their animals and people, slaves, servants that are with them, they're devouring everything. But as Alexander and his army begin to approach some of the cities, nobody wants a piece of Alexander. I mean, these are small cities, and they see a huge, enormous army coming. And the first thing they do is they send out dignitaries to meet Alexander and his generals, and they say, "Look, we don't want any trouble. Just come in, take over, and do what you want to do." Now, Alexander had learned something from his teacher, Aristotle, that he invoked in what he did. One of those things was, when he came to a city like this, he didn't tear it to pieces, he didn't burn places. He told his men, he said, "Look, these are Greek cities now." But he allowed the people that originally inhabited those cities to live autonomously, to do what they wanted, to keep the original government that was there, and you just had this big Hellenistic umbrella that was over them. Even with regard to their religion, Alexander was extremely tolerant and pluralistic towards the Persian deities. He simply absorbed them into the Greek pantheon of gods. So Alexander, the one thing I will say that he did do when he got into these cities is he Hellenized them, or made Greek culture an added feature to these cities. So what Alexander would do was he would build Greek temples to the gods, to Zeus or Apollo or Athenia or whoever, but he would also build a gymnasium and a theater and an agora, the Greek center for shopping. Now, about this time, King Darius gets some intel that Alexander and his army had penetrated further into Asia Minor. Darius doesn't take Alexander seriously. He thinks of him more along the lines of a menace or some young guy that he's going to quickly do away with. So he's not even going to meet Alexander on the battlefield. What he does is he gathers together some of his satraps from the various areas in the region. They were governors, along with some of their generals, and they get together and they form an army equal to Alexander's in number, about 50,000 of them. Now, one of the satraps posits the notion that instead of going toe-to-toe with Alexander and his army, they simply starve them out. They burn the fields, they trample the crops, they evacuate the cities, and pretty soon Alexander and his army will have zero resources, and Alexander will go running back to Greece with his tail between his legs. Well, the rest of the satraps and generals didn't think that way. They wanted to meet Alexander and the Greeks toe-to-toe, mano-a-mano, on the battlefield, just like the way the Greeks and the Persians had done it for hundreds of years in their battles and their animosity towards one another. So Alexander, after some time, gets some reconnaissance information from his scouts that the Persian army has been spotted on the banks of the Granicus River. Now, Alexander is very eager to get started here. He is motivated. He sends his troops double time marching until they arrive at the banks of the Granicus River. Just imagine this for a second. You've got on one side 50,000 Greeks ready to do battle. On the other side, you've got 50,000 Persians ready to do battle. And there's a river between them. Now, this river was actually a very shallow river. It was about knee deep, 30 meters wide, and it sloped about 5 feet gently on each side. So Alexander, like a good general that he would become to be, looks at the playing field. He sets up the Greek phalanx in the center. That was the battering ram of the Greek army. He puts himself and one of his cavalry on one side and Parmenion and his on the other side, and they're flanked by people with javelins, mercenaries, arrows, crossbows, everything, you name it. And what Alexander wants to do is he wants to be like a prize fighter. He wants to set up a 1-2 punch on the Persian army. So what he does is he sends a portion of his army up the Granicus River. Now, he anticipates what the Persians are going to do. They send a large swath of their army up the river as well. Now, this was a suicide mission that Alexander was putting these men on, but he nonetheless had to do it to win the battle. Alexander gives the cue, and these men go bulldozing across the Granicus River, and they are met with a hailstorm, a fury of arrows, javelins, slingshots, rocks, you name it, and the casualties mount quick. Alexander's guys are in trouble, but he knows this. He's waiting to time out when the Persians will run out of ammunition. Now, once he notices they're not pulling a lot of arrows from their quivers, Alexander, and when he sees that his men begin to retreat, Alexander makes his move. But, here's the but. Alexander sticks out like a sore thumb. He's got a bright breastplate on, huge shield from ancient Troy, and a shiny helmet with 2 white feathers that protrude out each side about 3 feet high. And the Persians see this, obviously, from a mile away. Well, the old saying goes, kill the king, end the war. They're going to follow Alexander wherever he goes and try and knock his head off. When Alexander sees his men retreating, he makes a mad dash with his cavalry, bursts across the Granicus, and the battle is on. This was the worst way to fight during antiquity. In fact, Arrian, the historian, says that it was horse against horse and man against man. The combat was in such close quarters that these men would oftentimes be 1 to 2 feet away from each other, shooting their lances, throwing their shields up. And Alexander, when he's in the thick of this, he's not on horseback. He takes several blows to the chest, a couple to the shield, and he's having a lot of problems. Suddenly, he breaks his lance, his primary weapon, and he's screaming to his men for someone to throw him another lance. Finally, Demaratus of Corinth throws his lance over to Alexander. Alexander catches it, and just as Alexander catches that lance, Mithridates, one of the Darius' son-in-laws, is charging him with the horse. Alexander lowers himself, positions, shoots his lance straight into the face of Mithridates, knocks him off his horse and kills him. At that same moment, Alexander gets hit from behind with a club, knocks his helmet off and actually breaks it. Somehow, Alexander is able to maintain consciousness. He grabs the nobleman, the Persian nobleman, throws him off his horse and shoots him through with his lance. At this point in time, Alexander's life is in the balance. He doesn't know it, But another one of Darius' son-in-laws is directly behind him with his sword drawn and bringing it down right on the back of Alexander's neck. Suddenly, Cleotus the Black, as the sword is coming down to the back of Alexander's head, Cleotus the Black slices off his arm. It literally cuts his arm right off. They kill him. And by that time, the Greek phalanx has pushed through, but he saved Alexander's life. But the Greek phalanx, as I said, was pushing through, and Alexander and Parmenion were able to outflank the Persians, and they sent them on the run. It was incredible. As the Persians were running, the dust was flying, the Greeks were chasing them, and finally they gave up chase. And Alexander had his first military victory, but it nearly cost him his life. His life was saved by Cleotus. Now, had Cleotus not been there, our world would be vastly different. Sadly, 6 years later, Alexander and Cleotus got into a drunken fight, and Alexander murdered him. With his lance, he threw it across the room. It shot into the chest of Cleotus, penetrating his heart and killing him instantly. Alexander was devastated. They were close friends, and he saved Alexander's life. And when Alexander became sober, he was just tore up by what he had done. But that was life in the ancient world. The things that they did were barbaric, even by ancient standards, the things that they did. But Alexander, as I said, won that war, and he now had control of the west coast of Anatolia. And what he did at that point is he made sure to close off all the supply chains and the ports so that the superior Persian fleet could not gain access there. Now, Alexander, that is so good, is an egotistical maniac. He hears about this Gordian knot when he's on his way to Phrygia. I'm going to talk about that in the next segment, and I'm going to talk about his first encounter with King Darius at the Battle of Issus. Stay tuned, and I'll see you soon.